Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Realistic Blacktopia, Why We Must Unite to Fight, by Derrick Darby, narrated by Diontae Black. Introduction. A hard-eyed view of racism. A CNN staff writer wanted my thoughts about the Atlanta hip-hop community's impact on the 2020 presidential and Senate elections. A big story at the time was the pivotal role that Stacey Abrams, Keisha Lance Bottoms, and other black women played in Donald Trump's defeat and the Biden-Harris victory. Elliot McLaughlin, who penned a piece on my fellow Queensbridge native, Nasir Jones, arguing that Nas was the greatest lyricist ever, was highlighting hip-hop's important contribution to flipping the White House. During our chat, we talked about Killer Mike, T.I., Big Boy, 2 Chainz, Offset, and Lil Baby, and how they and other rappers from Georgia were using their celebrity and social media platforms to transform American politics and shape the Democratic agenda. During the phone interview, which went well over an hour, my talking points were informed by 3 themes: conscious rap lyrics, film, literature, scholarship, and other sources of knowledge about race and racism in America follow a recognizable script. They shed light on past and ongoing racial wrongs, on racial progress, or lack of it, in realizing an imagined blacktopia, and on remedies to right racial wrongs and to make lasting racial progress. This book defends a perspective about how to pursue racial progress despite the persistence of racism and the enduring myth that America is a post-racial society. The standard progressive story about how to achieve racial progress in America is that it demands small tent remedies, focusing narrowly on what African Americans, usually black males, need and how to get it is an example of a small tent remedy. To put it crudely, the point of the story is this: if you want to secure racial justice for black people, then do shit for black people. I will use this illustration of a small tent remedy throughout the book. When we consider the transatlantic slave trade, black chattel slavery, the old and new Jim Crow, and enduring racial disparities, it seems hard to argue against the claim that African Americans represent the most harmed victims of America's racial wrongs. Yet some people will disagree, arguing, to the contrary, that indigenous populations, whose ancestors occupied the land long before Europeans and Africans arrived in North America, hold this unfortunate title. They will argue that if small tent remedies are the way to go, we should focus narrowly on what Native Americans need and how to get it. But once we start down this road, arguing over America's most harmed racial victims, it is easy to see how small tent remedies rapidly proliferate. And if we frame the argument more generally as one about America's most harmed victims of historical wrongs, many more small tents will pop up. There will be small tents for women, black women, women of color, poor women, trans women, religious minorities, persons with disabilities, immigrants of color, and so on. Racial remedies, one that targets a specific race or ethnicity, are a prime example of a small tent remedy in America, and they are among the most widely discussed and debated types of remedies. Various considerations explain this. Many people self-identify by race or ethnicity. However, as history reveals, such identification is not entirely voluntary in the United States. The nation has long identified people with racial labels, has assigned meanings to these labels, and has treated people in certain ways based on racial and ethnic membership. When focused on African Americans, the standard story places anti-black racism at the center of understanding past and ongoing oppression, subordination, and discrimination against blacks. Anti-black racism and white supremacy have also been central to explanations of why blacks are disproportionately worse off than whites in wealth, health, education, and criminal justice, and other outcomes. The prevailing logic of the standard progressive story is that race-specific remedies are required to address racial wrongs and to find a way forward. Or, as I will sometimes put it in this book, the path to racial progress, both new progress as well as holding on to past racial gains, and to corrective justice in America requires flying the race-first flag. I am a philosopher, and in my field, no one has done more to defend this view than Charles W. Mills, author of The Racial Contract. During the completion of my book, which is dedicated to his memory, I and many others within and beyond philosophy mourn the untimely death of this innovative and influential critical philosopher of race and racism. He was a dear personal friend and a significant source of inspiration for my work. Challenging the prevailing logic of the standard story is an especially formidable task because Mills, a champion of Black radical liberalism, has so vigorously defended it and has persuaded so many people with his arguments. Nevertheless, as I will argue in Chapter 4, Black Liberalism Can't Save Us, Mills's methodological commitment to theorizing about justice while taking seriously the historical and ongoing realities and manifestations of anti-Black racism helps to explain why flying the race-first flag is unlikely to secure corrective justice for racial wrongs. If anti-Black racism is as entrenched and pervasive in America as Mills argues, and if whites, particularly well-meaning liberals who might be allies in the struggle for racial justice, are psychologically disposed to deflect and resist charges of racism, the prevailing logic of the standard story will have serious limits. When focused on Black people, the standard story takes different forms depending upon whether it comes from Black nationalists, either those calling for immigration back to Africa or ones calling for building a sovereign Black government within U.S. borders, or from Black liberals, either mainstream or radical ones like Mills. Although their ideologies will vary, these storytellers agree on the importance of rallying around the race-first flag to pursue Black progress. It is important to distinguish two kinds of progress. There is the kind that gets a public apology for slavery, a federal holiday for Juneteenth, another street named after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., or maybe after Barack Obama or Breonna Taylor, or perhaps more token representation of Black people in positions of authority and power. We can call this symbolic Black progress. And there is the kind of progress that gets a massive influx of tax dollars directed to improving housing, schools, parks, community centers, roads, and transportation in Black communities. The kind that supports after-school programs, job counseling and training, and mental health services in these communities. And the kind that results in real police accountability to the communities they serve, criminal justice reform, and equity in schools that serve these communities. We can call this substantive Black progress. To be sure, both kinds of progress are valuable. It is important for Blacks to secure recognition that comes from monuments and demographic representation, and it is important for Black communities to secure the material resources and tangible outcomes that come from concrete policy-driven reform. However, we need to pitch a much bigger tent if substantive progress is our goal, and the reason is obvious. The substantive things Blacks want for themselves are also things that other marginalized populations want too. And to get them, we must unite to fight. To appreciate why the race-first logic underlying the standard progressive story about how to achieve racial progress is naive and unrealistic, we must confront America's post-racial orientation. I started working on this book in 2008 when Barack Obama was making his historic run for President of the United States. At the time and in the aftermath of his victory, much was written about post-racialism. On the one side were those who took this historic moment to signal that America was no longer a society that made race an obstacle to progress and living the American dream. Conservatives were not the only group singing this tune. Mainstream liberalism also sang it, along with significant portions of the general public. Harvard sociologist Lawrence D. Bobo summed up the prevailing ethos this way. To wit, American society, or at least a large and steadily growing fraction of it, has genuinely moved beyond race, so much so that we as a nation are now ready to transcend the disabling racial divisions of the past. From this perspective, nothing symbolizes better the moment of transcendence than Obama's election as president. On the other side were those, including Bobo and myself, who were skeptical that America had achieved this status, though it was certainly striving toward it. Social scientists were doing empirical studies linking durable racial disparities in wealth, housing, health, education, and criminal justice to forms of racial discrimination. And this evidence exposed post-racialism as mere mythology. Still, the myth prevailed. As I waded through the empirical evidence, I became convinced that whatever story we told about how to achieve racial progress in the United States had to assume this premise. To be clear, the premise is not that America is post-racial, but that, by and large, it takes itself to be post-racial. Some will wonder whether this premise remains valid in post-George Floyd America, where many Americans have experienced a so-called racial awakening. Is it still fair to say that America takes itself to be post-racial when so many Americans marched for justice in the aftermath of Floyd's death, when social justice initiatives are proliferating in education, business, and the arts, and when Ibram X. Kennedy's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and similar titles are flying off the bookshelves? I think the post-racial premise still rings true, and I am not alone in thinking this. In a recent essay entitled Our New Post-Racial Myth, Kendi proclaims the post-racial idea is the most sophisticated racist idea ever produced. It keeps resurfacing and mutating and harming in new forms. This myth is believed by many people, regardless of race, says Kendi, because everyone longs for a world without racism and is eager to embrace reasons for believing that this end is in sight. Historian Kienga Yamata Taylor's aptly titled New Yorker piece, Did Last Summer's Black Lives Matter protests change anything?, observes, even the most moderate Republicans still believe in the U.S. as a place where color blindness and unimpeded social mobility allow anyone from anywhere to reach the heights of social acceptance and personal wealth. But the truth is that this view, a core theme of post-racialism, is more widely endorsed by partisans across the political divide, as well as by their various constituents. Consequently, the change we have seen in America following Floyd's murder has been largely symbolic. Old statues commemorating America's Confederate past have been torn down, and new ones, including monuments to Floyd and Breonna Taylor, have been erected and sadly defaced. Juneteenth was made a national holiday, but a demand for voting rights and full inclusion into American democracy was a core concern during the first Juneteenth gathering by formerly enslaved persons. And today, numerous states have enacted laws that make it increasingly harder for Black people to vote. Juneteenth should be a reaffirmation of the importance of studying American history, and not just parts of it that makes us feel good and patriotic. We must also attend to the abhorrent historical legacy of Black chattel slavery, Jim Crow segregation, and systemic racism and their far-reaching consequences for the persistence of Black poverty, police brutality against Blacks, economic underdevelopment of Black communities, and the Black-white educational achievement gap, among other things. Scholars and educators of critical race theory have been at the forefront of teaching this history. But in post-Floyd America, critical race theory is under assault, charged with preaching hatred and dividing Americans, and there are ongoing efforts to ban teaching critical race theory in schools and universities. In addition, conservative publishers are putting out books with post-racial counter-narratives, with titles such as Blackout, How Black America Can Make Its Second Escape from the Democratic Plantation, Race Crazy, BLM, 1619 and the Progressive Racism Movement, and I Can't Breathe, How a Racial Hoax is Killing America. These books are also flying off the shelves in post-Floyd America. Taking the post-racial premise seriously is especially important if we want our philosophical ruminations about racial progress and how to achieve it to be grounded in the reality of our lived experience. The most significant implication of post-racialism is that it takes certain remedies for continued racial progress, for holding on to racial progress, and for corrective racial justice off the table. I make each point respectively in Chapter 1 on affirmative action, in Chapter 2 on voting rights, and in Chapter 3 on Black reparations. Although everyone may not believe the post-racial myth, many people in power and in high places do, including members of the U.S. Supreme Court, as well as state and federal legislators. And given the significant power the latter have in making law, and the former have in evaluating its constitutionality, we must reckon with the very real constraints this imposes on how to pursue racial progress in America. I tell a different story about racial progress in this book, and it is somewhat paradoxical. The best way to pursue racial progress for Blacks in America is to pursue big tent remedies. We need to focus broadly on building coalitions among marginalized populations interested in a range of issues that impact them collectively. Blacks, Native Americans, Latinos, women, working-class whites, persons with disabilities, persons identifying as LGBTQ+, dreamers, and other groups are concerned about jobs, housing, healthcare, education, discrimination, mental health, drugs, criminal justice, environmental pollution, the climate crisis, voting rights, and other pressing matters. And the truth is that they must find ways to work together on solving these problems to make lasting progress, racial and otherwise. When they work together, they can pursue big tent remedies, take collective responsibility for sustaining just and equitable institutions, and fight for making voting easier so that all can have a hand in democratic rule. I make each of these points, respectively, in Chapter 5 on post-racial remedies and in Chapter 6 on collective responsibility, and in Part 3 with 3 chapters on democracy and voting rights. The good news is that we need not lament the demise of small tent remedies narrowly focused on racial remedies, because if we pursue big tent remedies broadly focused on a constellation of matters affecting marginalized populations, and we fight for unfettered access to the ballot box, we can secure a realistic blacktopia in racist America. According to the standard progressive story, we should target the population that has been most adversely affected in these areas, e.g. the one with the highest unemployment rates, greatest residential exposure to toxic pollutants, lowest levels of educational achievement and attainment, highest rates of arrest and incarceration, etc., and pursue targeted remedies on their behalf. Some will argue that because African Americans are the most adversely impacted, and there is ample data to support this, we should pursue race-specific remedies that specifically address their situation. Reparations for descendants of African slaves are the most widely defended remedy of this type today. Not long ago, affirmation action was another example. However, to anyone taking a hard-eyed view of racism in 21st century America, looking at the courts, the legislatures, and surveying public opinion on race matters, it is obvious that such remedies are not viable. And if they yield anything, it will likely only be symbolic. But at some point, we must refuse to be content solely with museums, murals, holidays, and other symbolic gestures that do not amount to deep and lasting systemic changes. To be sure, these things can be sources of racial pride, but they do not put food on the table, reduce Black incarceration rates, improve funding of public schools and marginalized communities, or make it any easier for their residents to vote or to not have their votes neutralized by partisan legislators. Even after the nation's post-George Floyd racial reckoning, flying the race-first flag is not likely to yield meaningful and lasting racial progress in America. Indeed, as some of us celebrated the guilty verdict in Floyd's senseless murder by the police, as well as the tireless efforts of social justice protesters to raise awareness about racial and other forms of injustice, some lawmakers were busy working on legislation to silence protesters and to allow police to sue protesters for financial damages if injured, menaced, or harassed in the line of duty. This is one of many examples of how racial progress in America is swiftly followed by efforts to undo it. We see similar examples when taking a longer view of U.S. racial history. In 1808, the transatlantic slave trade is outlawed, banning the importation of new African slaves into the United States. But several decades later, amid calls for Southern secession from the Union, an act is passed in 1850 requiring that escaped slaves be returned to their owners. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, ratified in 1865, abolished slavery, but not long after Reconstruction ended, when the North and South struck a deal over a contested 1876 presidential election that removed federal troops out of the South. This made way for the enactment and enforcement of racial segregation and other Jim Crow laws relegating blacks to second-class citizenship. Observant students of U.S. racial history will notice this similar recurring pattern. America makes racial progress. It inches closer to embodying exalted ideals of freedom and equality, and to being a genuine democratic nation governed by and for all the people. But before the victory lap is completed, steps are taken to either undo this progress or to find new ways of maintaining the racial status quo. As bad as the pushback to police accountability and reform is, this is not the most troubling example of how racial progress is swiftly undone in America. The ongoing and systematic efforts underway to make voting more difficult for black and brown people and for likely Democratic voters in Georgia and other historically red states, as well as controversial laws to shift power away from election officials and to partisan state legislators, empowering them to decide close elections, are examples of rolling back the racial progress clock. And this is a much more consequential endeavor because it seeks to make democracy less inclusive. Although there was not enough time to pursue this point during the CNN interview, it was on my mind. However, before we were done, I did shed light on Georgia's dark past, singling out its infamous history of voter suppression. I did this not only to concede that there has been racial progress in the United States of America, but also to stress, more importantly, that whatever progress black people have achieved in this country has generally been answered with swift and concentrated efforts to undo it. So although post-Floyd America is awash in discussion about race and race relations, anti-racist books are everywhere, and diversity seminars are hot tickets, many efforts are underway to roll back the racial progress clock, including laws penalizing peaceful protesters, reducing penalties for striking protesters with vehicles, allowing police officers to file civil suits against protesters, and the demonization of critical race theory and teaching it in schools. I had these and other racial platforms in mind when I reminded the reporter of Georgia's dark past. And I had something else in mind that also speaks to the need for big tent remedies. The reoccurrence of such patterns has been, and is likely to remain, America's reality for the foreseeable future. To take a hard-eyed view of racism, a phrase used by the late legal scholar Derrick Bell, whose work inspires mine, is to start philosophical reflection on how to pursue racial justice and equality from this realistic premise. And this is precisely what I do in this book, by arguing for big tent remedies as a path to a realistic blacktopia. Growing up in New York City's Queensbridge public housing projects during the 1970s and early 1980s taught me many lessons. My beloved aunt, affectionately known in the neighborhood as Grandma Hip Hop, was the source of many of my most important lessons. When I am wrestling with philosophical questions and problems, trying to figure out what to think and how to argue for what I think, I often hear her commanding voice in my head admonishing me to keep it real. This saying means different things to those in the hip-hop community, but my aunt captured the core meaning. It's about truth-telling, even if it's not always what people want to hear. I had this on my mind, too. On one side are those who are quick to celebrate America's racial milestones, such as abolishing slavery, ending Jim Crow, and passing civil rights legislation, but slow to acknowledge how legally sanctioned apartheid followed slavery, informal segregation followed formal desegregation, and half-hearted commitments to enforcement of black civil rights, combined with increased attention to reverse discrimination against whites, followed the civil rights era. This group of racial optimists who fail to take a hard-eyed view of racism will not want to hear about all the ways that racial setbacks and white backlash follow racial progress in America. On the other side are those who acknowledge the racial milestones but highlight the ways that America taketh as quickly as it giveth when it comes to race matters. Here we find two groups: those who insist on pursuing race-specific small tent remedies, even in the face of this reality, and those of us who remain skeptical about this strategy. The former will not want to hear about big tent remedies, worrying that blacks will come up short in securing what they need, and that America will fail to overcome legacies of anti-black racism. Those of us in the latter group defend the urgency of taking up big tent remedies, believing that this is a more viable pathway and that it can secure much of what blacks need right now. To wit, this book makes a case for skepticism about the sufficiency of small tent remedies to achieve racial progress and urges big tent remedies as a way forward. It is important to stress that these remedies are tools or strategies that can help secure racial and other forms of justice where post-racial mythology prevails. My big tent approach to racial progress takes inspiration from the Black activist tradition, especially examples set by Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Angela Davis. They taught us valuable lessons about how we must work together to get real power and about how we can only secure substantive progressive change with real power. And this power must be directed toward addressing the problems we all live with. Alicia Garza, co-creator of #Black Lives Matter, belongs to a younger generation of Black women who appreciate this insight and who use it to orient organizing activities on behalf of Black lives. The crucial lesson is to link the Black struggle with a broader struggle on behalf of the 99%. A realistic Blacktopia is the just and equitable world we can pursue free from racial subordination and domination by engaging with other marginalized groups in a collective struggle against all forms of social injustice, subordination, and domination. In her book, The Purpose of Power, How We Come Together When We Fall Apart, Garza writes, "As organizers, our goal was to get those in the 99% to put the blame where it actually belonged, with the people and institutions that profited from our misery. And so, Unite to Fight is a call to bring those of us stratified and segregated by race, class, gender, sexuality, ability and body, country of origin, and the like together to fight back against truly oppressive power and to resist attempts to drive wedges between us. More than a slogan, the 99% asserts that we are more similar than we are different, and that unity among people affected by a predatory economy and a faulty democracy will help us to build an unstoppable social movement." A Realistic Blacktopia argues for lowering the race-first flag and moving beyond racial politics. Forget race-based affirmative action. Forget a Black Voting Rights Act. Forget racial reparations. If we want to get closer to the elusive ideals of racial justice and equality in 21st century America and withstand predictable efforts to undo racial progress, paradoxically, we need to fight for big tent remedies to racial injustice and for more robust democratic rule to realize them. This approach to racial politics and racial progress may not get us the most familiar Blacktopia we can dream up, but it can get us closer to one that more effectively addresses our most pressing needs and can endure the volatility and vindictiveness of American politics. To pursue what is effective is not to forsake what is ethical. Seeking a realistic Blacktopia is rooted in making our normative commitment to the dignity of all persons more robust. The pragmatism that permeates the argument in this book is principled and not merely strategic. America is far from being a post-racial nation. However, many Americans operate with this myth. This means that in practice, securing substantive and lasting racial progress with race-specific small tent remedies will face legislative and judicial dead ends. The way to move forward is to build big tent coalitions among marginalized populations interested in a range of issues that impact them. This is principled because it is rooted in valuing the dignity of all persons, and it is strategic because it takes seriously the very real limits on small tent remedies, such as ones that focus exclusively on race. Many of the issues that Blacks care about are also ones that concern other marginalized groups dogged by a predatory economy and a faulty democracy. To address this, we need to build coalitions among marginalized groups to tackle the problems we face collectively. Lowering the race-first flag and pitching a bigger tent is a means to doing this. To echo Garza's prescient words, we must unite to fight.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?